I think, in your career is to be a T-shaped person. So basically, you have a lot of breadth, but you have a deep specialty, right? And so if people ask you like, but what do you actually do? Like, what's your real specialty? I can say I'm at the very intersection of neuroscience and AI.
Yeah.
Those are the two things that I'm good at, and specifically that intersection. And, in that intersection, there's really not a whole lot of people. There's maybe like 100 people in the world that like really care deeply about this set of topics. But that's your depth right there.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Data Scientist Show. I'm Daliana, and today we have Patrick Mineault. He is an independent scientist and neuro-data scientist. He has a PhD in visual neuroscience at McGill University and a postdoc at UCLA studying how the brain produces meaningful representations that drive behaviors. He later worked at Google as a software engineer studying how people view and interact with web pages. He was also a brain-computer interface BCI engineer at Facebook Reality Labs, building a BCI that allows you to type with your brain. He has around 10K followers on Twitter talking about neuro-AI and writes a blog sharing his career journey and learnings along the way. He was the CTO of the first edition of Neuromatch Academy, an online summer school in computational neuroscience. All their materials are free and available online. And there's a fun fact. Patrick and I met around 7 years ago when we used to be housemates in LA. So it's great to hang out in person again. And welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
So I'm very excited to talk about your work in neuro-AI, brain-computer interface, understanding the brain through artificial neural network, and your journey from postdoc to Google and Facebook. And we're going to do something special here. We're going to drink some grape juice. Cheers.
Special grape juice, yes. Cheers. That's how we say it.
Yeah, just a regular Saturday morning, two data scientists talking about brain, AI, career while getting hammered. No, we're not.
We are being very reasonable, of course.
Yeah, but we might. Okay, so you studied math and physics in college. How did you get into computational neuroscience and later data science?
Yeah, so I think right around the time where my classmates were deciding to get into grad school, I was like, oh, do I really want to study string theory? It's in physics, the questions that you can ask, they're so far away from reality because a lot of these problems have been solved in the 19th and the early 20th century. Whereas, in neuroscience, you can ask almost any question and it's going to be a meaningful question, even as a novice. So you can ask a question like, what is sleep? Like, what is the role of sleep? What does it do? And that is a research subject in itself. You can easily do a PhD on that. Whereas they say that you really have to be at the end of your postdoc in physics to get to the point where you can ask yourself questions which haven't been answered already. So there's all these ripe fruit for the picking. So I got lucky enough to do a minor in neuroscience while I was doing my joint honors in math and physics because I figured I didn't have enough on my plate. And I was introduced to a professor where I did a summer internship. And so that was how I found my master's and then eventually PhD lab.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And so after you finished your postdoc, can you tell us how did you get into Google and what was the first project you worked on?
Well, yeah, I mean, we were in the same place at the same time while I was doing this search, and I remember, we were so for the benefit of people at home, we used to live in this house that was in Westwood, not very far from UCLA. And that had a lot of postdocs and a lot of grad students that were kind of in the same situation. Like, what am I going to be when I grow up? And so I got kind of into the same thing where, maybe 6 months or like 9 months into my postdoc, I was like, what am I doing in terms of career paths? Like, do I really want to be a scientist, given that it's quite difficult to get a professorship and those sorts of considerations? So I started doing online classes. So I did Tim Roughgarden's CS, data structures and algorithms class on Coursera. And I started, knocking on different doors. And at the time, I really didn't know where I was going to end up. So I applied and tried to get into a bunch of different places for which it was a very poor fit, or I was wildly underqualified.
Yeah.
But then eventually, through time, I found my way. But I applied from things like hedge funds to, startups in San Francisco, to artificial intelligence research places, a lot of different places. Then I ended up at Google.
Yeah. So what was the first project at Google?
So, Google is a big place, and it's very, I'm sure that when you came to Amazon, you must have been like, wow, there's a lot of stuff here. Right. And so a lot of these big companies have the same process by which they introduce you to the systems the companies have, because a lot of the tech stack is completely custom. It wouldn't be like off the shelf things that you would already know about. So I got assigned to one of these projects, like really focused on software engineering, like data engineering, like building data pipelines, and to be able to visualize them. And I think like the impression that I got out of this initial project was like, wow, there is a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes to really make this this thing happen. So it gave me a little bit of entryway into the world of like understanding how such a big organization can create code that can capture data and bring value out of that data. But when you start out, you just have like a tiny view over everything that goes on inside the company. Right. So it's very, very difficult. Like if I think that people might have a kind of a skewed understanding of like, well, you can just go in and like suggest something and it will be meaningful.
Right.
But, the reality is that most of the ideas that I would pitch to my manager, it was like, well, we tried that 2 years ago. We tried that 5 years ago. We tried that 10 years ago. It didn't work, or it's already implemented, but you don't see it, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So it was really a process of, taking my knowledge of software engineering practices and then applying it to this new system, which for which it was very difficult to understand the entire thing.
Yeah. So you were studying neuroscience, and did you feel there's a disconnect between your research and your work at Google?
Yeah, definitely. But there's always a way, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that when I came into this group, which is called FAANG-Patrick, so it's a group that really does data science for ads and determines, for instance, should we do this launch versus that launch? What are the top line metrics? How is, things like CTR and revenue, and making sure that those things stay rock solid, because obviously that's very important to the company's bottom line. And so when I came in to this group, that was, the majority were PhDs in stats, right? And I come in and I'm like a neuroscience guy. They were like, "What are you doing here?" I say this in jest, that people were obviously like very respectful, and I think that there's a lot of people inside these companies that are just generally interested in other areas of science and engineering. So I got like a pretty warm reception, but it took me a while to find a time and a place where I could really apply that knowledge that I had about the visual system, which is what my PhD was about, to problems which mattered for the company.
Yeah. So what was the problem you were trying to solve there?
Yeah. So it's an interesting question. So I had a lot of discussions with my manager about, okay, so software engineering, like how could I really do something interesting on the software engineering side? But, locally, I didn't really have a lot of peers for software engineering because it was mostly a statistics group. So I was kind of disadvantaged in the sense that I was trying to learn software engineering at a big company, but I wasn't inside of a big software engineering group, which means that I would have kind of had to come with already the knowledge. So it wasn't a very good fit for the software engineering side. But something my manager told me about, I thought was very interesting. He was like, "Oh, you're a visual neuroscientist, and we do like these vision experiments sometimes. Like things that I think like affect the eye." So I was like, "Oh, okay. Tell me more. Like what is that like?" And I can talk about this publicly because there was an article in the press that was published in The Guardian, which you can all look at home. But there was this famous instance where there was some engineers or some designers, I should say, went into a design meeting and then proposed to different engineers and to the top brass 3 different colors for the blue links.
Yeah.
And
links for a Gmail.
I think it might have been for Gmail, or it might have been for the search engine's result page.
Okay.
Like this was a long time ago. So in any case, they couldn't decide like which one was the best.
Yeah.
So they just decided to run an A/B test, right? Like a very large scale A/B test. So, and the name of this experiment was 50 Shades of Blue, right? So, of course, inspired by the famous book. But the idea was to try something like 50 different experimental arms where they tried different shades for the blue link, and some of them just had more positive metrics than others. So I think the number that's quoted in the Guardian article for 2009 was something like $200 million, which would come up to 1% of revenue.
Yeah.
So obviously, like these are big numbers. And when I was told about this story and I read about it in the press, I was like, whoa, okay, I'm a visual neuroscientist.
Yeah.
I care about how humans interact with the world visually.
Right.
And you're telling me that right now there's experiments with millions of people in each experimental arm, and they're doing real world tasks which have real world stakes, and you're getting all this data and you have like these tiny error bars. My mind was absolutely blown. Yeah. Right. And so I figured like, oh, I know about visual neuroscience. I know how to do these experiments in a way that is more theory based. Yeah. And then the combination of the theory base plus, the statistics base, I think is a very powerful intersection. Yeah. So I did a lot of experiments of that type that really focused on, different visual changes.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And I know we're all familiar with A/B testing and also different type of designs. So how specifically did you apply your knowledge in like the visual kind of neuroscience to this experimentation?
Yeah, so I think it's more about, so I think that the stats part, they definitely had it completely, well handled.
Yeah, right. I know you guys have very powerful internal tools in Google.
Absolutely. So, there's excellent infrastructure to do massively parallel experiments. So that's already existed. There's multiple experimental layers that we can use. They have the infrastructure to run multiple experiments in parallel. To calculate statistics, archives of what happened over time, and there was also old experiments that had been done that were that mostly affected the look and feel of the page, and then I could analyze those as well. So all these elements came into place. I had like a huge toolbox to work with. It's not like I was building this stuff from scratch. From nothing. However, where my knowledge of visual neuroscience like really came into play is how do you understand these the changes, right? And how do you suggest new changes to the web page depending on what you know about the visual system.
Yeah. Cool. Can you maybe give us just an example, like what did you suggested that someone from just pure statistical training wouldn't know?
I can't really talk about that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And later on, did you move to the Google Brain group?
No, so I ended up staying in this group. So we did, work on multiple analyzing, past data from different launches, and also working on our own launches.
Yeah.
And I think it was a very fruitful kind of collaboration where we were able to make some, really exceptional launches during that time. But I really stayed inside of this group, and I got to learn a lot about statistics, which is a different thing than what I was doing during my PhD. So, the bread and butter of the kinds of visual neuroscience that I do is GLMs, right? And especially essentially correlating how a neuron responds to different kinds of things that you view in the world. And so the tool of the trade at that time was generalized linear models, and in particular Poisson models. And I got to work on a lot of other different kinds of tooling that I'd never known about. So one thing that I never knew about was about experimental design. Like, how do you power your experiments? How do you determine how well powered you are?
Yeah.
Causal inference, right? So that's often a problem, because sometimes we have experiment data, but other times we have observational data.
Right.
And so there are questions in neuroscience, in my field of specialty, that people don't necessarily think directly in terms of causal inference, but where the principles of causal inference have a lot of good things to say. And I think you interviewed Conrad, right?
Yeah, I interviewed
and that's
Conrad.
so Conrad Cording, of course, full professor at UPenn, and that's his main field of study.
Yeah.
Well, one of his main fields of study is causal inference for neuroscience. So I was able to glean a lot of that insight from that group. So I think you have to be very opportunistic about these things, right? When you're in a group, so to get back to our time in LA, I was not opportunistic when I was in LA, right? So I had my lifestyle in Montreal. I biked to work, and I did these kinds of things, and then I moved to LA, and I was like, I'm going to LA, and I'm going to take my my Montreal lifestyle, and it's going to go great. And then I found out that if you live in Westwood and you don't have a car, it's not great.
Me either.
So that's an important lesson, right? If you're in a place, you gotta take the things that you're given and make the most out of them. So in that case, what I had world-class statisticians that I was at, and I was able to, learn as much as I could from their practices, and take that back to, different kinds of problems in technology and in research, and which are equally applicable, for instance, to startups. So you got to be opportunistic, I guess, is the TLDR.
Right. And also, I remember when we lived in the house, you organized a reading group. And did you also have a community to read papers together at Google?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that when you're an adult learner, it is so easy to fall off the rails, right? So you're like, I'm going to start this book, and it's going to be really hard, but life gets in the way, right? We're a little bit older now. I won't say numbers, but we're at the stage where we have responsibilities, and we have work, and so on and so forth. So the first thing that's going to go is that you're going to lose track of the things that you want to study. But a friend of mine whom I was working at Facebook with told me, if you can read a book on some technical subject an hour a day, I can guarantee you that at the end of the year, you'll be a heck of a lot smarter than you were before.
Yeah.
And that kind of persistent learning is so important. But different peoples have different levels of motivation, and are more or less easily distracted. So I don't know how you are about distraction.
Yeah. So I try to have some sort of routine, but I think for different people, different strategy. applies. So some people might works well with some type of structure. I read 1 hour a week and I tried that. I just think it doesn't work. I'm the type of person, I like things when they're a little bit unstructured, more like kind of a cycle. Maybe some days I don't read at all, but maybe some days I really are curious about something, then I might just spend 5 hours reading about something. I think that type of flow works better for me.
Mm-hmm. And I agree, you know, there's different kinds of flows that are very useful for different people. But I think that having the social pressure of coming to reading group and, you know, you come in and you're like, I didn't do anything and I didn't read the paper or I didn't read the chapter. I didn't do the exercises. And I'm just like kind of here, like sitting and, and waiting for things to happen. Just makes you feel the worst.
Right. So like nobody's public shaming you, but you
but you feel the shame. The shame is there.
Yeah. Maybe I need to join a reading group.
Yeah. So I had a chance to. So there was already a reading group when I came in at Google for the second edition of Kevin Murphy's book. So Kevin Murphy is a researcher. I think he was at UBC before, and then he moved to Google. And he has this book on probabilistic machine learning. And so he was working on a second edition. This was right around the time that, you know, deep learning was really making a dent in industrial applications. And he had a first draft of the book and he was like, well, it would be great if people at Google, you know, looked at this draft. So I joined this reading group and, you know, after a little while, I got a chance to run the reading group. So it was a great occasion to meet other people in other areas of the company that weren't necessarily inside of Google Brain, but that were interested in problems in machine learning.
Yeah.
And interestingly, a lot of the people that I met there, they did end up working on artificial intelligence and machine learning later on, right? So they might have been software engineers in ads, for instance, and, you know, slowly made their way to, for instance, Google Brain. So that was both a mechanism for me to hold myself accountable.
Yeah.
Like, I'm running this thing. I should be, you know, I should show up to meetings. I should have read the things. I should have done the exercise. And I should actually like kind of understand what I'm talking about, even though I didn't at first.
Yeah.
Right. So it's kind of a fake it till you make it, but it would definitely like help me learn a lot more about machine learning, surrounded by people who were, you know, very knowledgeable. So, you know, Kevin Murphy helped us out every once in a while, you know, telling us about, you know, different kinds of ideas. And of course, sharing with us his draft of this book that wouldn't have been available anywhere else. He just released, I think, he just released the book now. You know, it's been like 6 or 7 years. Yeah. It took a while. There's a lot of stuff that's happening in machine learning.
Yeah. So I think the benefit of working in a big company is maybe you're in a group that's not related to the area that you are most interested in, but you can still talk to the people. Like I have some people joined Amazon. They just message me, hey, I saw your LinkedIn post and can we have a chat? And then, you know, you can network with people, and like you did, you find a group. And if the group doesn't exist, you can create your own group, keep yourself accountable. And also it's a great way to network.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have to bring intent into this because, I mean, the company is huge, right?
Yeah.
It's very easy to just focus on your own group, plus maybe like the 2 or 3 groups that are like right around you and literally nobody else at the company. But ultimately, you know, a lot of interesting product decisions come from interactions between people that would normally, you know, not really talk to each other. So it's good to create these kind of faraway links inside the company.
Yeah. And so then how did you get into Facebook?
Yeah. So I'd been contacted by a recruiter. So I'd been a year and a half at Google, and I was contacted by a recruiter who was like, oh, you know, would you like to apply for a machine learning engineer job? And so I kind of kept it in the back of my mind, but then I saw an article in, I think it was Business Insider or one of these types of publication, maybe TechCrunch, that said that Facebook is working on this brand new project to read brain waves or read brain information and then translate it into text. And I was like, that sounds awesome. I want to be in on that. So the next time that the recruiter contacted me, I was like, well, I'm not interested in machine learning engineer job. I would like to apply for this, skunkworks project. And she was like, well, I don't really know, like this is kind of a new effort. Like maybe, it would make a lot of, I'm not sure it would make a lot of sense. But she actually, followed through and talked internally to a recruiter. And within 3 days, I was having my interview. And then 4 days later, I had my offer.
Wow.
Yeah. They were looking for, this is a very strange combination of things, but they were looking someone with industry experience, of course, so they didn't want somebody that just had a postdoc, that had a neuroscience PhD, that was both a coder and that knew a little bit about or had interest in hardware. And there's maybe like 3 people that in the whole world that have that right? At that time. Now it's a little bit more common. Of course, neurotech is a real thing, and there's Neuralink and a lot of these companies. But at the time, it was a very rare kind of combination of things.
Yeah. And like you mentioned, they're looking for people with industry experience, although your work at Google wasn't directly related to brain-computer interface, but still contribute to your resume.
Oh, it absolutely contributes to your resume. But industry experience is, I think, more than just direct experience with, system X. So you can say, so some jobs will say, like, you have to know SQL and this particular version of SQL for this particular purpose. So it wasn't like really about that, like about knowing a particular system. It was knowing what are the kinds of questions that people care about in an industrial setting. How does that differ from the academic setting? How do you interact inside of a big company? Like all of these things were important to this new project.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about the project? How do you type how do you type with your brain?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting idea. So I think that people should know about some of the technologies that people use to read brain activity. So the first thing is that, if you read from a single neuron inside of the brain, its signal is going to be correlated with either the kinds of sensory inputs that it receives or the motor outputs that it can create. So you can look up a video online of the robotic fist bump, which was this experiment or this study which was done, and it was a demonstration that you could read information from the motor cortex, right? So the arm, and so from the arm representation inside the motor cortex, you could read that directly with these invasive electrodes, and then use that to control a robotic arm. So you could do something like feed yourself chocolate, even though you're paraplegic, for instance. Right? So you're just moving your limbs, but by the power of thought. That seems... it seems like science fiction. But when you think about it, what happens is that there's information that's in the motor cortex, which are the parts that that move the limbs, and then normally it would be routed eventually to the spinal cord, and then eventually to the muscles in order to create movement. So if you could just bypass this process and just go a little bit higher up the chain, you can figure out what are people's intent to move. Speech is quite similar in that sense to so I'm speaking right now, right? So you can see that my throat is moving in time with what I'm saying. And in fact, there's a lot of muscles inside of the vocal tract that are being controlled. So in that sense, speech is also a motor thing. And there's a lot of semantic information that's also available inside the brain. So if you combine all these things, you have this hope that maybe you can actually decode the intent to speak using different kinds of methods and then translate that to text. For the same reason that I can take the sounds that are coming out of my mouth, which are just very small changes in pressure in local air pressure that get picked up by a microphone, and then I can translate them into text using, for instance, wave to text. I can use different kinds of transformer architectures. There's different deep learning systems that are able to align speech signals to text. So you could potentially, or at least it would make sense that you could do that using directly the brain signal, which after all is it's like trying to measure how a puppet moves, right? You can measure it from my fingers, or you can measure it from the movement of the puppet. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, there's a lot of different places where you can get the signal.
Got it. And trying to understand the data science and machine learning element of it. So if I understand correctly, so the in our brain, the neurons, if I want to say something or I want to move my body, it would generate some sort of image that we're able to scan it and then translate
sort
it?
of. So the image aspect is... So there's this thing inside the motor cortex, which is called the homunculus, which just means little man, right? And it's a map that goes from the motor cortex to the body.
Yeah.
So basically, if you look at two different areas inside of the motor cortex, which are close to each other, they tend to represent areas on the body which are close to each other. But we have overrepresentation of some parts of our body because we have very fine movements in these places. So the speech and the vocal tract, as well as the fingers, are two examples of such places. So basically, it's this exaggerated map. But inside of, so in the sense of, if you want to take an image of this area, then you would see that, hypothetically, if you had this image, you would see, the hand area or the hand knob area is a little bit more active than the other areas. That means that the hand is active, right? Or same thing with the speech vocal tract. You would see like a pixel that lights up in the speech area, and you would say, "Oh, this person is speaking." But in fact, at the more granular level, at the level of individual neurons, you'll find neurons that will be selective or will respond or will be correlated with like the movement of a finger, right? Or the movement of the forearm that you might do. In order to move a joystick. Yeah. So it's really a question of solving a supervised learning problem, right? Ultimately, when you think about translating speech to text, it's a problem of the classic way of setting up this problem is that you'll have the data from a microphone. It'll be sampled at 44.1 kilohertz. And then, people will typically do a couple of pre-processing steps, like they'll calculate Fourier coefficients, and then they'll take the Fourier transform of that. They'll give them the substring, and they'll take this input and try to align it to a textual representation of said thing. And the textual representation can have different kinds of representation. So it can be a character by character. It can be word parts. It can be whole words. It could be, pronunciation of words even. And then you have like some dictionary at the end that comes in. Yeah. And then it's a soft alignment problem that happens, right? So which you could solve with something like an RNN, or these days you would mostly use something like a transformer. Yeah. Right. So the core of it is basically after you collect those images those texts, it become either a computer vision problem or natural language processing problem. Yeah. So I think that there are clear ways in which these problems kind of parallel each other, right? If you're talking about something like language, well, it's like we know how to process language and translate it into text. Yeah. So, you would want similar kinds of ways of translating the brain information, because it's just one other method of recording the signal. But it's not necessarily an intuitive method. Like if you look at you couldn't look at a neuron and react the same way that if you hear somebody's speech, for
Yeah.
instance, right? So we have our own transfer functions that we need to decorrelate out of this whole thing. But if someone is interested in the field of brain-computer interfaces, and they're wondering, like, what areas of machine learning should I be studying in order to be relevant to this field? So there are several. So first of all, like your classical linear models, I mean, that's your bread and butter, right? Your GLMs, right? Your generalized linear models. Your dimensionality reduction techniques like, PCA and the like. Very important core things in neuroscience. Then in the world of machine learning, both supervised and unsupervised models. And I would say that if you're interested in this particular field, sequence models, right? Because remember, everything that happens in the brain happens in time. There's no such thing as a meaningful snapshot of the brain at any one time. Right? So anything that has to do with time, that models something that changes over time, is probably the right thing to look at. So whether it's transformers or RNNs, for instance, that whole part of the field is really interesting. Unsupervised models, I think, are also quite relevant to people. Like, you want to find good representations. So for instance, one problem that people will have when they do BCI is that, your camera, it doesn't change from day to day, right? It's basically the same camera, but the brain, it changes, right? So you want to read out information from it in a way that those changes from day to day don't matter so much. So in order to do that, you have to, or it's possible to do different kinds of unsupervised learning that try to separate out, that information which changes from day to day from the information that stays constant. So that's another part, I think, which is interesting to learn. But if you followed so far, it sure sounds like the parts of machine learning that you should learn about if you want to do BCI is most of it.
So
and it is.
That's very exciting, because before I talk to you, I just feel like this kind of very mysterious area that I don't know what was the prerequisite to get into, but sounds like you do need to have some domain knowledge about the neuroscience, understanding the brain, but the core is the deep learning methods that as data science, we will probably already know how to apply them. So my question is, what are the challenges when you work on processing those images or like those texts?
Well, so I've mentioned one, which is that your signals are going to change from day to day. So we don't really realize it, and I don't want to. If anybody is a little bit squirmish, is a little bit sensitive to the stomach at home, just. I'm sorry about what I'm about to say, but the brain is a very squishy thing, right? So the brain has about the consistency of butter, of like warm table butter. It's true, right? So if I take a knife, it has about the same Young's modulus as table butter, and that's like squishing inside of your brain, and then there's blood that's being pumped up. So the whole brain is just like some very, very squishy kind of place to look at. So it's not like an engineering system where you can be like, I'm going to take this lead and I'm just going to solder it on something and it's going to stay exactly this way and it's not going to move by more than a few microns. I mean, the whole thing is just moving all the time. And in fact, if you go on the internet right now and look up fMRI models of what happens during the heartbeat, it's incredible. Like the whole brain like basically bobbles up and down with the heart. So anyways, the point with this is everything moves, everything is squishy, and everything is kind of a mess. So that's a big challenge, right? Like the fact that my signal now might not mean the same thing tomorrow is a huge problem. So if I have something like, so let's take a look at something that we can discuss in a little bit more detail because there's been some details that have been put out in the public,
Sure.
like Neuralink's implant.
Yeah.
Right. So you have like a bunch of these neural threads. These neural threads are, well, they're just like they're little tiny wires, basically. They're little micro wires, right? And they're going to be put next to different neurons. So they're going to listen to these different neurons. And there's, I don't know, like 1,000 of them or something like that. So you have a time series, which is, 1,000 like parallel measurements. And the sampling rate, I don't actually know what their sampling rate is, but it might be something between 10 and 40 kilohertz. Maybe they just detect these little blips, right? So when an individual neuron spikes and communicates with other neurons down the line, it creates this little blip of electrical activity. And so maybe that's the only thing that's communicated. I haven't looked in detail, but the kinds of problems they're going to have with that is like, well, this is, if it's, for instance, at 40 kilohertz and there's 1,000 of these in parallel, that's a huge amount of bandwidth to deal with.
Yeah.
Right. So just thinking about like, okay, how do you do like machine learning when your data sets are, terabytes, but just for like one day's data, and you need to concatenate, hundreds of days of data worth to be able to do something useful. So that's a challenge. The fact that it changes from day to day, and so these things are inside of this hot environment. So maybe they'll corrode over time. Maybe the impedance will change. I mean, these are real physical systems. To get back to maybe something that's a little bit more intuitive for statisticians. My wife was collaborating with a statistician at UCSF, and he told her this story where they were doing this health research, and I'm not sure exactly like where it was, but it was about like 15,000 kilometers, or about 10,000 miles away from San Francisco. And what he told her is that he would get on a plane and then fly to this place, 10,000 miles away, and make sure that the data was entered correctly in Excel, basically in these spreadsheets, or in whatever other system that they used, to make sure that they had the right data. So data quality is the most important thing. So statisticians definitely know this. And getting consistent data is so important. And you have exactly the same thing in neural data analysis. So I think like the deep principles, they really extrapolate from one area to another. Maybe you're not convinced, and you're like, I think that this is actually very, very different than what I do.
No, it's actually, a lot of times the challenges did come in the data part, and a lot of times the model doesn't work. It's not because the model is not advanced enough. It's because the data is not good, or the assumption you had when you collect the data is flawed. So how did you tackle that challenge then?
Yeah, how can you tackle the challenge? So I think that for the day-to-day thing, there's different research on how to deal with drift. It's possible that if you have microwires, for instance, they're going to displace a little bit from one day to the other, so that you basically have like partial observations. So essentially, maybe on one day you have 100% of the data, and then the next day you'll have 30% of it is going to be censored, right? And you don't know which day is which day. So people have different ways of doing that. So they can do like template matching, so that, maybe if you record for 60 days, on the 60th day, it's actually more similar to day 57 or to day 42 or to day 3. And so you can use this kind of matching to basically, the calibration of the system, you can, load from these previous days. So that's the kind of thing that people do. Other times people will do things like load, just fit a giant model that concatenates across every day. And then maybe they'll have like a readout head, and they say that, well, there's some intermediate layer, and from that intermediate layer, I shouldn't be able to read out the identity of the day, right? So
what do you mean by identity of the day?
Okay, so to translate that into like maybe more common problem in statistics, it's the problem of de-identification, right? So if I have some model that predicts, that try to predict a person's credit score from various data. It's very easy for demographic information to sneak in through the back door, basically, and to make its way into how the score is predicting things.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you've heard of this. So you might have some automatic system that determines a person's credit score, and they'll use a person's address and how long they've been at that address, and that's correlated to zip code, and zip code is correlated to race, for instance.
Right.
So basically, your credit score model becomes racist automatically,
right. Profiling.
Just from the it does profiling. So one way to and this is a real problem in real life, and so if you want to read about this problem, I think these are really the important problems in taking machine learning models and putting them in the real world, making sure that they don't reinforce biases.
Yeah.
But the thing is, when there's multiple steps of the way like that, it's very easy to lose track of provenance, and that the model has all these biases you might not even know about it.
Right.
So one way to do that is, instead of basically censoring race, for instance, in a predictive model, but there might be other ways in which things which are correlated with race enter into the model. What you might do instead is have a layer inside of the model, and that where you try to predict race, right? And if you can't, then you can infer that the information that goes through this bottleneck layer does not contain information about race. Does that make sense?
Can you say that again?
Yeah. Sorry. This is a bit of a complicated concept to grasp, but basically the mutual information between the classification of or the regression, if you're talking about credit score, and a person's demographic characteristics. And I use race as an example.
Yeah.
It could be gender. It could be something like sexual orientation, all these things that are protected. So we want the mutual information between the intermediate representation, and which is going to be used to make the classification, and the mutual information between that demographic characteristics and the outcome to be zero, that you couldn't infer back just from the classification of the model, basically a person's demographic characteristics. So one way to do that is you have some bottleneck layer which contains all of the data, and then basically you try to adversarially predict the demographic characteristics from the data.
Yeah.
So if you've correctly factored out the demographic data, you shouldn't be able to read out the information, the demographic information. Right. So that's one approach. And I don't want to make this is not my area of specialty, and I don't want to make light of the subject, but I encourage people to read deeper into it, into these de-identification or debiasing techniques, which are very important. Yeah. But you can imagine that you can use a similar system in order to factor out, for instance, the day that you did the recording. If you can't measure out and infer the day, then that means that the representation that you've learned is kind of independent of the day. Yeah. Right? In the same way that your credit score representation is going to be independent of a person's demographics.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And also from the article you sent me about this brain-computer interface, it says it's basically focusing on design, evaluate novel neuroimaging method based on optical, radio frequency, ultrasound, and other entirely non-invasive approaches. Is this the main difference compared to Neuralink? Because you mentioned there's like a little wire.
I'm trying to read to read this
so my
information.
notes is basically is the Facebook Reality Lab is this mostly about non-invasive approach? Is this the kind of the novel thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of companies right now are focusing on invasive technologies, right? Or we might talk about minimally invasive technologies. So some of them are include things like having electrodes inside of the motor cortex, but making them so that the electrodes are far away from the blood vessels. So that's Neuralink's thing, right? Because they have these micro wires and they have this robot surgeon and they, moving away from arteries, so you have less bleeding. You can have something like what Paradromics does. They're in Austin, Texas, and they do like massively parallel recordings. So that's another kind of approach. You have companies like, I forget the name of the company, but they market this device, which is called the Stentrode, which is basically it's an electrode that you put inside of a blood vessel. And then in the same way that you can put a stent in your heart, you can put a stent way up there and basically records local information. And that's pretty minimally invasive because you don't have to have a brain surgery.
Right.
But all these approaches are fundamentally like much more invasive than putting on a helmet, right? And that's the ideal case scenario is you would just want to put on a helmet and would be able to read the activity of your brain to arbitrary accuracy. So really, the novelty here is to be able to do this kind of thing just totally outside of the brain. But of course, it's a very ambitious and very difficult goal. And I think a big challenge when you're in an industrial environment and you have these incredibly ambitious goals is to reduce these ambitious goals to practice in ways where you can show milestones on a continuous basis, right? So maybe your company, they have like a big shindig every year, right? So they have like some big meetup, and that's when the top company brass will be able to see the outcome of these different skunkworks projects, for instance. And so being able to reduce these very complicated projects and to put them into milestone-based things so that people can see the effective progress, that's the real challenge. I think over time, we will absolutely be able to see like this vision that we have that we'll be able to read all brain information at like almost perfect accuracy.
Yeah.
There's nothing in the laws of physics that says that it's impossible. It will almost certainly happen. But the problematic is to be able to, demonstrate that at a consistent rate over time so that, people see the progress over time.
Yeah. So when you work at Facebook in the lab, is it similar to your research as a postdoc? What is the difference between?
No, it is very, very different.
Yeah.
So what I realized, I thought, after going to Google and staying there for a long time, I thought that I understood what industry was. And of course, having been an academic for a long time, I thought that I knew what academia was. And then when I came to Facebook Reality Labs, I realized that there is a third way, which is very, very different, right? Which is industrial research. It functions on totally different principles than industry development, right? So if you already have a product and you're just like trying to ship improvements upon it, it's a very different thing than developing a new product. It's a very different thing than developing a prototype of a product. It's a very different thing than to demonstrate a proof of concept that you will be able to come up with a prototype that will eventually make it into a product. So it's more researchy. But the key, I think, in all of these cases, and this took me a very long time to really grasp, is to be able to take your incredibly ambitious vision and split it down into little boxes that you can chew, and making sure that basically you've addressed the things where you have the most uncertainty about first, right? So if you're building a product and you're shipping it, maybe the thing that you want to do now is to maximize your metrics right now, right?
Yeah.
So like maybe you want to increase your revenue as much as possible, or maybe increase the number of users of your app as fast as possible. In a research setting, what you want is to reduce the uncertainty about your project as fast as possible. And understanding that, like the value of just information is it's a lot harder to quantify.
Yeah.
And necessarily it's a different environment to be in. But once you understand that, you can really thrive in that environment. But it's important that if you're thinking in terms of KPIs and ship dates and that, it's very different kind of mindset than when you're in an industrial research environment, right?
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And going back to the challenge with data, so I never worked with a neural data before, and then my assumptions is the sample you collect from the individuals are kind of limited. And then you might resample from their actions. So I know for different individuals, how our brain works are largely similar, but still everybody have some differences in their brain. So was it difficult to combine?
So let me ask you a question.
Okay.
Is my blue your blue?
Is there blue, my blue? Maybe, I don't know.
Exactly.
We will never know.
This is, of course, like the classic question about like whether our percepts are similar.
Right.
So actually, the ratio of blue cones to red cones to green cones is very idiosyncratic from one person to the other. So we do see colors a little bit different from one to the other. So that's like the classic neuroscience answer is it depends. Yes and no.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of individual variation. Now, when it comes to doing invasive brain-computer interfaces, I really want to, say to people that it's possible. People have done it, right? They've been able to record from motor cortex, and you're able to do things like control cursors with your mind, control robotic devices with your mind. But the number of people that have been able to do this is in the double digits, right? This is not like consumer neuroscience. It's not 1 million people that have this. So I'm forgetting the name, but there's a famous research project that not the Brain Initiative. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a brain problem right now. But there's been an ongoing research project for a long time doing motor rehabilitation or motor BCI, and it's been ongoing for 20 years. And there's been 30 people that have gone through this study that have had the implantation, and then now have like a knob basically in which they can like plug themselves, so they can plug themselves into the computer. But it's 30 people, right? So like, how do you extrapolate from 30 people to 1 million people? Yeah. So I think our best tool to understand how neuroanatomy changes from people to people is our large scale projects, and they're largely non-invasive, right? So there's a project which is called I think it's from the UK, which is called the Human Connectome Project, or HCP. And I think they're trying to scan something like 10,000 brains, right, to figure out what's the difference in between the connections of one person versus another person. So there's a lot of these challenges where, and if there's brain atlases, of course. So, I did my PhD at the Montreal Neuro. There's an atlas which is called the MNI Atlas, which is the Montreal Neurological Institute Atlas, which was started there. But now there's larger and larger atlases, and they're basically, ways of looking at anatomic variation in different people. And there's anatomic variation, and then there's functional variations, right? So very briefly, my blue is not necessarily your blue.
Right.
Yeah.
And do you have a specific procedure to handle the heterogeneity problems? Or do you have some assumptions that most of the time, for example, I'm going to raise my hand, it's going to be the same region light up on the image?
Yeah, so there's different ways of attacking this problem. They're kind of similar in flavor to the day problem that I was telling you apart, right? I was telling you before, in that you want representations which factor out like what day you did the recording on, but you also want to have representations which factor out like which person specifically was actually doing the experiment. So that's one way to do it. In the fMRI world, so functional magnetic resonance imaging. So people go inside this big magnet, and we're measuring, this radio frequency precession inside their brains to be able to figure out in each little volume, like how much extra brain activity they have. And so in this world, there are very well established methods, things that are made for functional alignment, in which case it's basically like a non-rigid alignment problem. You have functional alignments, you have hybrid methods, you have things which are called like hyper alignment, which tries to learn a Procrucis rotation from one to the from one to the other. These are basically unsupervised or semi-supervised learning problems. And so the methods are pretty well established in the fMRI literature, where they have the possibility of having large-scale data sets. When it's invasive in humans, it's much less so. And when it's non-invasive but not fMRI, the methods are also not as well developed. Primarily because the spatial resolution of non-invasive methods outside of fMRI is pretty low. Right. So you can be like, well, you're so if you put your helmet on and your helmet is like 1 centimeter off, but the resolution is like 3 centimeters, then it doesn't really matter that much. Right. So in the EEG world, it's not as common as in the fMRI world.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It's kind of fascinating to think about it, because when you think about processing images or text, it's a deep learning problem, kind of fall into the big data category. But when we think about the actual sample from, say, 30 people, it's actually another small data problem. It's like a combination of small data and big data. You're dealing with different type of variances. What are some challenges, using deep learning on those type of data?
Well, I think you named them very well. If you have giant data sets and then on the input side, and then your labels are very, very sparse, which is typically the case with human behavior, then you have a huge data bottleneck. So I think some of the most interesting approaches are methods like unsupervised learning for this, and things like self-supervised methods, for instance. So in the self-supervised world, there's been a kind of a Cambrian explosion in the last 3 years of people really focusing on self-supervised methods. So maybe for the people at home, we can say a little bit about self-supervised methods. So a classic problem in image recognition is ImageNet, right? So you have 1 million images, there's 1,000 different labels, and you're trying to create a map from each image to the labels. The problem is that, in some data sets, you don't have that much labeled data, right? You might have far more unlabeled data than you would ever have labeled data. So can you create a method that is able to read information and it's able to use the data distribution in order to create like kind of good representations, but without image labels, right? But images have all sorts of wacky properties. So, for instance, if I have a label, so let's say that I'm here and I'm here, I am the same person.
Are you?
Yes. in my four-dimensional manifold of X, Y, Z, and T, yes, I am the same person. So that means I have, there's a pseudo label there, right? So if you take like 2 snapshots of us together, they represent like the same reality. And so I can say, well, I don't know what the actual label is for these for these 2 blobs, but regardless, they're a positive example of something. Whereas if I take the camera and I point it at some other random place, you could say, well, that's a negative example. So you can create these artificial data sets or like these virtual batches, which are, for instance, contain different translations, contain different color schemes, contain different scalings, rotations, etc. And those are your positive labels. And then you can say everything else, like random samples that are outside of these this picture of us, is going to be the negative examples. And then the goal of the training is to find some representation in which you can tell these things apart.
Yeah.
So if you learn things that way, and there's a lot of different methods to do this that have come online, like SimClear and Moco, and there's also related semi-supervised methods or multimodal methods like CLIP, which you may have heard about. So all of these are based on this premise of same, but different, but still same, right?
Yeah.
Like these two things are kind of the same. They're a little bit different, but they're kind of the same. And so you basically apply pseudo labels. And then over time, if you present a lot of data to these models, they're able to essentially cluster together images which come from the same data distribution and cluster away other things. And that means that they've learned essentially image class for free. So then you can use this precious labeled data, but not for learning the representations, just for learning the mapping from this representation to class labels. And so, for instance, if I do like radiography, right, or if I do like my wife does OCT, right, so she does retina scans, and so getting ophthalmologists to label scans and then say like this is this part of the eye and this is this other part of the eye, it's very expensive, right? You can't do that on standard labeling platforms, right? So you have to have like these very expensive experts that label this stuff. Getting the data itself is really expensive. So if you want a labeled data set, there's no way to get one for less than $1 million, right? So if you have some startup that's like, we're gonna scan people's eyes, label it, and then figure out what's going on with their eye, it's impossible.
Yeah.
So what you can do instead is do something like self-supervised or unsupervised learning, and then you just sprinkle a little bit of supervised data on top, rather than using your precious supervised data for learning the data distribution. Have you heard of Jan LeCun's cake intuition, or like his cake metaphor? So Jan LeCun, of course, is the director of Facebook AI research. He's been there for a long time. He's the guy that created convolutional neural nets, Turing Award winner, etc. And so the way that he likes to describe this is with the cake metaphor, right? So you have cake, and the cake itself, like the gluten, the flour-based thing inside, that's like unsupervised learning, right? There's just a lot of data that comes from the data distribution. Take one image, let's say it's 1024 by 768. When it's decompressed, that's 3 million bytes of data, right? It's a lot of data. Whereas when you go on top, right? So he says the crémage, I guess like what's the sweet stuff that you put on cake? The frosting. Sorry, it's just living in Montreal, my brain is 80% French now. So the frosting on top of the cake is that's the equivalent of supervised learning, right? So for ImageNet, for instance, the labels. Think what log 2 of 1,000,000 is, right? So that is, I think it's like 20 bits of information per label. So on the one hand, you have 3 megabytes per picture for the unsupervised, right? For the data distribution, but for your labels are only 20 bits. So which is not very good, right? Okay, so that's an example where there's a real mismatch in that. And he says, reinforcement learning, that's the cherry on top. Because reinforcement learning, your rewards are going to be so incredibly sparse.
Yeah.
You can have events in your life which are rewarding and which will happen literally only once in your life. So, I got married. So that's an example of like something that was very rewarding and for which I have like exactly one example.
Yeah.
And I hope to keep it at one example. Of course.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. That sounds like the self-supervised learning works pretty well in this situation where you have a lot of labels and some of them are a little bit like similar or ambiguous to.
Yeah, exactly. So you can find good representations of data without requiring very tedious and very expensive labeling. So people are using them more and more, both in human neuroscience and for applications and also just for research. So I think that that's an area of research where definitely like the space is wide open for people that want to come in and learn a little bit more about this. I wrote a blog post about unsupervised learning methods that also includes a very, very short segment on self-supervised learning on my blog. That I wrote that a year ago. And since then, there's been a lot of research even on it. It's a very like fruitful area of research if you want to get in there and you're like, I like self-supervised learning, but I think the field is saturated. I've got news for you. You can apply your knowledge to neural data science, and that would be really useful.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. So now with self-supervised learning, you're able to do some classification. And then for this research project, do you have any preference on false positive, false negative? Which one do you dislike more?
That's a very good question. I think that people generally for research projects don't do so much. Like they want to show like the raw results. Like here's how much variance I accounted for in my data, or but people haven't like necessarily been thinking too much about how do you tune these things very well. So there's been a long history in neuroscience research of using the ROC curve and the area under the curve in particular, which basically like the decision is not to have a decision essentially. But clearly if you care about applications, like if you're like in another field of health research, if you're looking at diagnostics, false positive and false negatives are very important. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then when we think about wearing a helmet and then detect some actions based on signals from our brain, I don't know whether this research has been in production. Like, do we need to think about the latency of the processing, like how fast the model run to have inference? Yeah.
So that's a very interesting question. I recently looked into the kinds of accelerators that you can get for on-chip computer vision. Right. And it's really quite amazing the amount of operations per seconds that you can get for a couple $100 now. Truly remarkable compared to even 5 years ago. So I think that in terms of latency, of course, latency matters for humans, but you have to understand that we have a little bit of leeway that comes from the fact that humans are naturally latent. So humans have latency, right? So if you think about, let me make you like a little guessing question. If I step on your foot, how much time do you think it takes for the information to get to your brain?
I don't know, 10 milliseconds. But now after a sip of wine, maybe 20.
So it's interesting because the speed of propagation, it really depends on the neuron. But for these longest neurons in our body, which in my case would be about 2 meters, it could take about 100 milliseconds for the signal to actually, which is a long time, right? That would be like 3 frames in a 30 frames per second video. So it is quite long. Nature has found ways to make neurons which are a little bit faster. So one of my favorite stories about neuroscience is that a lot of the research that, a lot of the reason why we know so much about neurons now is because of this creature called the squid, right? Which is a marine creature.
Yeah.
And the squid has this thing which is called a giant axon. Now, I want to be clear, it's not the axon of a giant squid. There is such a thing as a giant squid, and it's terrifying.
Yeah.
Don't look it up online. It will. You won't be able to sleep for a long time. But even small squids have this thing called a giant axon, and the reason is that these creatures they like to escape. So if they see like a big shark, they're going to be like, okay, I need to get the heck out of here as fast as possible. So what I just told you about, the delay from my foot to my brain, if I have to wait 100 milliseconds for my foot to start moving,
right,
I'm already dead, if I'm in front of a shark.
Yeah.
So the way that they solve this is they have this super, super fast neuron and with an axon, which has a lot of myelination, and it's huge. You can see it with a visible eye. Like the stuff inside of our brains, you can't just like look at it and be like, oh, I can see the neurons. That's not how it works. They're tiny. But these guys have these huge, huge, huge neurons. And it turns out that the bigger the neuron, the faster it actually propagates the information.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Bigger the neuron, you're talking about the size of the neuron?
Absolutely. And it just turns out that the math comes out this way. So if you know a little bit about electrical engineering, it's the same reason why big wires that it can support higher voltage or like a higher amount of current than smaller wires. So it turns out that because it's so easy to look at this big neuron, a lot of the early research on how neurons work were done in this model, and so we owe it to squid that we actually understand our brains.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, like we learned something from squid, so probably that explains why you have a more complex to kind of neural network, I don't know, structure, or when the dimension is higher. I mean, it's not necessarily useful for every use case, but if you're processing very complicated data, you do need more layers or a bigger network.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one thing that the people might be aware of is that when Jan LeCun worked on his came up with the convolutional neural net, he was inspired a lot by some neuroscience research. Yeah. Right. So knowledge about the visual system and how it does these different kinds of selectivity and invariance operations, and from that created these layers of selectivity and then max pooling in order to create like that basic structure of the CNN. If you look at the brain, like an actual visual brain, maybe the number of layers is only like 10. You could argue, or 6 or whatever, but they're recurrent. So it turns out if you unroll it, then it actually ends up being lots and lots of different layers. So that being said, for the purpose of industrial applications, like what kind of latency are you talking about? So if you're doing something like motor, like you're trying to control a motor arm, like the latency basically determines your spec, right? If it takes the signal 100 milliseconds to get to the muscles, and then the muscles themselves, they're not instantaneous, right? I mean, the muscles are, because this all has weight, right? So that means that you're not like that much limited by latency, because it's going to be faster than a human would be able to do with their own arm anyways. Yeah. It's remarkable how much we're able to accomplish despite the fact that we have such large, we're starting like way behind the start, and yet we end up like pretty far off on the finish line.
Yeah. Is mentioned is max pooling also inspired by brain or neuroscience?
Absolutely. So there's this fun thing that happens in our brains that was discovered by Hubel and Wiesel. So the research I was talking to you about, about the squid, that was one set of Nobel Prize winners. I'm going to talk about another set of Nobel Prize winners who are David Hubel and Thorsten Wiesel. But they looked at different neurons inside of the visual cortex. And what they found is that you have these neurons which, if you present, let's say, a white line, they're really going to respond very strongly. And others like black lines, right? And that have the same orientation. So let's say like vertical lines.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that there's neurons which like both white lines and black lines. It doesn't matter what the actual contrast is, right? As long as it's more contrastful than the background, and they don't care whether it goes from white to black or black to white. They just like the orientation, and these are called the complex cells. So this combination of simple cells, which have a thresholding operation, which is similar to a ReLU, and complex cells, which have this pooling operation, which is similar to a max pooling, creates the kinds of selectivity that we see in the visual cortex. Now, that was the insight that both led to, one of the insights that led to the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine for Hubel and Wiesel. And it also led to the insights of Jan LeCun with the CNN, which then led to a Turing Award. So, learning about the brain can be can be a good career move, I guess.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So you also mentioned about the activation functions. Are those all also inspired by how the neurons like?
Well, it's a very interesting question. So if you look historically, I think the first example was the perceptron. Right? And the perceptron is basically a step function, which is, as you know, is a terrible activation function. So it turns out that if you take a step function and then you put a little bit of noise, because we know that neurons are very noisy, right? They integrate information, and they have a lot of noise that comes from just the transmission of synapses and the fact that it's, like I said, it's in a squishy environment and all these things. So if you look at that, you basically take this threshold function and then you nudge it randomly from left to right. So what you're going to get is
activation.
Yeah. So the activation, if you just nudge it left to right, and it was originally a step function, and then you convolve it basically with the noise.
Yeah.
What are you going to get?
A signal.
It's a sigmoid.
Oh, sigmoid.
Right? So instead of having like the pure threshold, you're going to get like a smooth version of the same. Yeah. So the actual answer that you get if you have Gaussian noise is the error function, right? The ERF, right? Which is just the cumulative distribution, the CDF of a Gaussian, right? So for a long time, people made deep neural nets that had sigmoid functions because they were like, well, that's probably what's going on inside the brain. But later on, there's been a lot of research on the kinds of activations functions that are actually implemented in visual cortex. And it's a little bit more tricky than that. And in fact, now we tend to use basically smoothed ReLUs to model single neurons inside of the visual cortex.
Yeah.
So they still have like kind of a linear effect. And then the saturation doesn't really come into play. And it turns out that the saturation is really bad for neural networks because it makes training much less stable, right? Because you have like these flat places inside of the gradient. So it's one case in which if you follow the neuroscience in a very literal fashion, you can be led astray because it turns out that it's a lot better to use ReLUs and other functions which don't saturate.
Yeah. That's very interesting. What are some other inspirations in deep learning research that originally from neuroscience?
That's a very good question. There's a great review article from Demis Hassabis from a few years ago, and he also made the argument that reinforcement learning was originally inspired by the brain.
Yeah.
Right. Like this idea that we can essentially learn from reward and then use it to change our behavior was originally inspired by some of the research in neuroscience. So I think it's historically interesting. But I do want to be very careful that the people at home, that you don't need to know a ton about neuroscience in order to make a good model that's going to be useful for a neuroscience application area. But just learning the principles so that you can speak the same language is, I think that'll get you 90% of the way there.
Yeah, and also help you get some intuition of those, the math, the formulas, help you tell the story when you learn a new algorithm.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I was saying about when you're working in an interdisciplinary team, I think we talked about this in the pre-interview.
Yeah.
When you're working in the interdisciplinary team, like if you're trying to build a neurotechnology application, you're going to work with people that are going to have a bunch of different specialties. You're going to have mechanical engineers, electrical engineers. You're going to have software engineers. You're going to have neuroscientists, neurologists. Maybe you're going to have ophthalmologists. Who knows, right?
Yeah.
You could have a bunch of different people are all working on the same problem. And I think the first order of business is just to get all of these people talking the same language. So I will tell you a thing that I did at Facebook, and you might think that it's a little bit extreme. Okay, but hear me out. So there was a neuroscientist on the team, and she was a speech expert, right? So she was an expert on how the brain processes speech and then translate it into waves that we do with our throats. So before my first day, I looked up her PhD thesis and I read it from cover to cover.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, 200 pages. So I think that made it so that it was just a lot easier to talk to each other, even though it was a bit of a slog at first because it's a very unfamiliar area for me. But I took the time when I did the interviews actually to read a single paper from every person that interviewed me. And I think that helped ultimately in my quest to create a common knowledge, right? Like a common knowledge base where we could all talk to each other. Now, I've had the incredible experience in my career of working on a lot of different problems which have almost nothing to do with each other.
Yeah.
But so I think that's my superpower, right? You've heard about the concept of a T-shaped person.
No.
So the idea is that you can be a person who's hyper specialized in one area. Yeah. Right. Like one of my early mentors at Google was mentioning a friend of his who is an expert in bidirectional text, right? In BiDi. So if you're mixing, for instance, English and Hebrew in the same page, there's all these wacky rules for how you can do it because, Hebrew is right to left and English is left to right. And it's very complicated, the rendering stack. And he's the world expert in that one thing. There are other people who are, so that's somebody that has like depth. But there are other people that have breadth. So they just jack of all trades, master of none. So they just learn a little bit about everything, and they just seem to be able to do a lot of different things. The ideal place to be, I think, in your career is to be a T-shaped person. So basically, you have a lot of breadth, but you have a deep specialty, right? And so if people ask you like, but what do you actually do? Like, what's your real specialty? I can say I'm at the very intersection of neuroscience and AI.
Yeah.
Those are the two things that I'm good at, and specifically that intersection. And, in that intersection, there's really not a whole lot of people. There's maybe like 100 people in the world that like really care deeply about this set of topics. But that's your depth right there. So if you have this setup, you can both work cross-functionally across, talking with people that have other kinds of disciplines as you, right? If you have a lot of depth but no breadth, then something like being a consultant, I think, is a good option, right? So let's say like a corporate lawyer is like the perfect example, somebody that has like a lot of depth,
right?
And that might not know about your particular problem and might not particularly care, but they will have like a lot of depth, and it's a perfect occasion to be like kind of a consultant. But if you're working on these like multidisciplinary, multifunctional cross team projects, you have to be shaped you have to be T-shaped, right? So one of my big functions when I was there is to build that bridge between, people maybe from a physics background or from electrical engineering background, a mechanical engineering background, so we can all like speak about the same language. And I realized that maybe the most useful thing that I could do is not spend all day in Jupyter Notebook, right? Which I like. Maybe it's not spending all day in Jupyter Notebook or pushing a lot of code, but maybe it's just sitting down and doing the same kind of thing that I'm doing right now, like explain things. Like what are we trying to do? How are we going to do it to different people that might not have the same vocabulary as you? And so always being able to bring back your intents and kind of mapping it to a person's background, I think is, that's a superpower.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And I think, I like the T-shape. I think as you explained, I probably heard it before. And I used to think, should we become an I first and then grow to a T, or you grow the horizontal line and then go deep? And I actually have seen people from both ways, right? Some people deeply specialize and then they venture into other area. The benefit of that is you build a kind of a credibility in one industry, and then it's easier for you to network, gain leverage when you get into another industry. And some people will be like, oh, I just want to be a generalist. I'm not really sure what I want to do. And then, but they keep going, they keep exploring. And then one day they find something they're really interested in, then they go deeper in that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think like a great place to explore is when you're in college. And if you're like me, you can stay in college until you're well into your 30s. Highly recommend it to everyone. I'm being facetious, of course, but that's a great place to kind of explore, right? Because you have a lot of liberty. And my PhD advisor told me, you should take a lot of classes now. During my PhD, you should take a lot of classes now, because you have to realize that you will never be able to do that again ever in your life. And I was like, whoa. So in addition to taking classes in neuroscience and computational neuroscience, this is, which was the natural thing to do, of course, at the time. I also took classes in computer vision, very different era of computer vision, by the way. Right, because we're talking about like 2008, 2009, so it wasn't deep nets.
Nobody would connect those two things together,
and machine learning, which again was classical machine learning, Bayesian stuff. It wasn't deep learning yet, but having this basis was super useful in building my career. It turns out that machine learning class is probably the most useful class I've ever taken. Right. That and linear algebra when I was in my first year of undergrad. But you don't know, right? So exploring across a bunch of different areas is quite useful. The other thing that I would say is, if you want to give yourself the chance to explore, you first have to put in the hard work and learning the hard disciplines in order to be able to give yourself the power to do that.
Yeah.
Right. So it's so much harder to learn linear algebra after you've gone to your whole undergrad and you've gone to business school and you're in industry and you're like, I want to be a data scientist and let me learn linear algebra. That's so much harder than learning it when you're an undergrad, when you have all the time in the world to think about this stuff. And you're like, wait, do I take like a row and multiply it by a column, or do I take a column and multiply it by a row?
Yeah.
Right. So I would say go into the most mathy discipline that you can as an undergrad. And you can always go to business school later on in your life. It's fine. And there's never going to be a time that's better than your early 20s to like really do math stuff. You can always do it later, but it's just, if there's people at home that are listening and they're kind of early on in their career, they're still in school or whatever, just take all the math classes you can. You'll never regret it. And I know that it's kind of ironic because some people grow to hate math with a passion.
Yeah.
But it's so useful in the future. And it's just a lot easier to learn when you're young.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And I think it's really awesome that you're in the intersection of neuroscience and machine learning. So have you seen any influence on the neuroscience research that kind of derived from deep learning research? Like,
oh, absolutely. We're in a golden age of that right now. So it's been wonderful to see that.
Yeah.
At the end of my PhD in 2013, I spent most of the year inside of Theano. So you might know about Theano. It was the precursor to TensorFlow, and not the precursor, but an early framework in deep learning that preceded TensorFlow and then PyTorch. And it was kind of a pain to work with at the time. And it was, kind of buggy, and it gave bad error messages. And it was still the days where I remember very well, I had a discussion with a grad student at Berkeley who was working on similar problems than me. And I was telling him that I was training a deep net, and that was very hard because who knew how to do that back then?
Yeah.
And he told me, "Oh, what's really good? And like replace your sigmoids by ReLUs." And I was like, "Really? Should I do that?" And it was like, "Oh yeah, it totally helps. Like you should see this stuff. Like it's gonna converge so fast. You're never gonna believe it."
Yeah.
And he was like, "Oh, when you do like your gradient descent, like you really want to normalize things." And I was like, "Really? Should I do that? That sounds kind of hacky." And so I learned a lot actually, like at that time, because there's a lot of stuff in deep learning that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it's just a purely empirical.
Right.
So which you have to learn, through like deep and terrifying experience. So that takes a long time, and so I was happy to be at the start of that. But then later on, and so I should say that at that time that wasn't a popular thing to do, right? And I kind of abandoned that project, like right when I was coming out of my PhD. I was like, okay, I don't think that this deep learning thing is really working out. Like, I don't think it's going to be like that important. And I was talking to it. It's so funny. I gave presentations at, Society for Neuroscience, which is the big conference in neuroscience about this stuff. And people are like, meh, deep learning, what is even that? Like, who cares? And oh my God, like 5 years later, it was like everybody's all in on deep learning and in neuroscience. I think that this is, if people are wondering, like, is it a good time to learn neuroscience and AI and that like intersection? It is absolutely the perfect time. We're in a Cambrian explosion of excitement about this. This is not, of course, the first podcast that I go on. A lot of people are excited about it.
Yeah.
So I got contacted by, Yannick Kilcher, I think recently, telling him about this stuff. And I just think it's like, wow, you can learn about the brain, but using it on your computer. Like neuroscience research has never been accessible before, right? Because you had to have a big lab and test tubes and all this stuff, right? But now it is. Everybody can do a little bit of neuroscience research at home.
Yeah.
And that's just, to me, as a practitioner in the field, it's just an incredible time to be alive. So it has helped us tremendously in neuroscience research. First, the tooling, right? So computational ethology is one example. It's a very complicated way of saying, looking at how animals move as a function of time. So if I want to do something like understand the behavior of lions in a den in somewhere in nature, how am I going to do that? I'm going to use cameras, but then how do I track them over time? But now with deep learning, I mean, we have semantic segmentation, and that's much, much, much easier to do. And there's been tremendous amount of research because, fundamentally, if you want to study the brain, you also have to study behavior and how we move and everything. And now people are doing both at the same time, doing brain and behavior. So that's one way. But there's even more influential ways of thinking about the brain in terms of computers, which is we found that these CNNs, which were inspired by the brain, are actually a lot like the brain. A lot more than we would expect by chance. And that's been, so that was first understood around 2014. And this research has just exploded since then. Now we're at a point where we're kind of tiling every part of the brain. We don't really know about this part of the visual stream. Boom, now we have an in silico model of the brain for that region, and for the hippocampus, and for the dorsal visual stream, and for frontal lobe, and pretty soon we'll have tiled the entire brain. So it's a very exciting time.
Yeah. So when you talk about the model, are you talking about some architecture similar to the layers of CNN when you try to understand the brain?
Yeah. So how do the different layers of a CNN relate to the brain? So there was this amazing research in 2014 looking at how these different layers relate to the brain. So it turns out, I was telling you earlier about Hubel and Wiesel's work, and that was really in primary visual cortex, which is kind of the first stop for the visual information. It turns out that this kind of operation of selectivity and invariance is done at multiple different stages inside the brain. It's done at stage V2, at V4, and in the different subsets and the different subparts of area IT, which is the inferotemporal cortex. So you can think about it as a big, deep neural net, right? So what you would expect from that, if the brain is literally doing the same thing as a convolutional neural net, what would you expect from that? Well, that means that the first layer of the neural net should be kind of like the eye. And the second layer should be kind of like the thalamus. And the third layer should be kind of like the primary visual cortex. And the fourth layer should be like V2, and so on and so forth, right? It should recapitulate the entire visual hierarchy. And so what people have found when studying, in particular, this set of visual areas that are selective for shape in objects, is that they look a heck of a lot like what you would see in a CNN that's trained to solve object recognition. So in other words, you take a neural net that's trained for ImageNet, right? So to categorize 1 million images into 1,000 different categories, you look inside and you find that the lowest layers look like the lowest layers of the brain, and the middle layers look like the middle parts, and the top layers look like the top part. And the variance accounted for is surprisingly high. And it's only been getting better and better over the years. So to give people, I know that I ramble a lot, and I've been talking for a couple hours now. So originally people looked at what's inside the brain to figure out whether the core operations that can create visual recognition. Yann LeCun looked at that, and Fukushima before him, and said, what if we implement this inside of a computer?
Right.
And then people implemented it inside of the computer so well that they're able to solve image recognition. That was the 2012 moment where ImageNet was first, quote unquote, solved by deep neural nets. And now people have taken this research on these in silico caricatures of the brain and reported back, like, do they actually look like the brain? And it turns out they do.
Yeah.
And that's super exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because that means that now you have a model of the brain. And you know what sucks is doing neuroscience experiments. Like, it really sucks. It takes a long time, you know, like just think about the mechanics of bringing, like, let's say it's an fMRI experiment, right? You have to buy a $2 million scanner, right? You have to have technicians, which are paid $500 an hour in order to maintain it. You have to put people inside of this like very loud enclosure that's like 110 dB of noise, and give them like noise canceling headphones. And they have to sit inside of this tiny box for 2 hours and absolutely not move, like move in less than half a millimeter.
Yeah.
I mean, it's terrible, right? If you can avoid that as much as possible, then you should do it. So now we have these models, and, you know, import torch vision is so much easier than like doing all this stuff with functional magnetic resonance imaging. So you can imagine a future where if I want like the best model of the brain, instead of having to scan somebody, I can just literally like download it off of GitHub.
Yeah. Wow. That's so exciting.
It's super exciting, and it's teaching us a lot about who we are as humans, and what does it mean to be alive, and like all these like wacky questions that the philosophers have had for, you know, the last 2,500 years. You know, my blue, your blue.
Yeah.
these are the kinds of questions that now we can really start attacking.
Yeah. I previously talked to a friend. He's a deep learning researcher, and he has an interesting statement. He said, the deep learning models, the architectures are not interesting. The data is interesting, because if you think about our brain, you know, just the same as the deep learning, the architectures, if we grew up in Mars, where there's no culture, no other people, this kid is gonna grow up really boring. But because we grew up in the Earth, we are trained by, you know, our neighbor culture, we travel, so that make it interesting. What do you think about, you know, data versus model?
Oh, that's such an interesting point, and I really like the way that you put this. Because that's the question, nature versus nurture. So I think it's a little bit of both, right? When we, so first of all, I think at the early part of my career, I thought that models were everything, right? Yeah. Because this is the trap when you do things like leaderboards and so forth, and you have fixed data, and you try to just like maximize that 1%, 2% to get like that extra little variance. And so you think that the most important thing is my model. I'm going to ensemble these models. I'm going to add like this feature engineering and all this stuff. And at the later part of my career, I was like, oh, wait, I can just get more data. And oftentimes getting more data is like way more, you know, quote unquote, bang for your buck than you would doing models. Data is cheap. It scales to gather. Whereas data scientists, they like to eat. They like to stay in expensive places. I mean, they're just way more expensive than it is to collect more data. So it turns out that data is far more important than models. Now, if you're thinking about research, like what do I think? Like, do I think, you know, like the nature versus nurture, like what happens inside our brain? I think it's a little bit of both. Yeah. So we published a paper in, actually 2 papers in Neurips that kind of get at these kinds of questions. Like when you're learning during development, you know, when you're learning to move about in the world, what matters? Is it nature or is it nurture? And so I can get a little bit into that if you're interested in this question. So I've often been interested, you know, during my PhD and later on, in the areas of our brain that don't deal with object recognition per se, that deal with motion, right? Because motion is such a part of who we are and of our evolution. You know, the smallest beings, they might not have been able to recognize each other at true vision. Like I can recognize you, even though I haven't seen you in, I don't know, like 3 years or something. But a lot of lower mammals or insects or mollusks might not be able to do shape recognition or face recognition or anything like that. But what they are able to do is motion recognition, right? They're able to use motion in order to navigate inside the environment. And that's very useful evolutionarily. And so the question that we asked is, so we had all this data from different parts of the brain that deal with motion. And so we asked ourselves, okay, so if we look at pre-trained neural networks that solve like the equivalent of ImageNet, but over time, are they aligned to the brain? Does that look like what the brain does? And it turns out that people do look at different kinds of neural networks that are trained on 3D recognition tests. And by 3D, I mean X, Y, and T, right?
Yeah.
So like little movie clips. So there's all these data sets like something where you're trying to, or Kinetics 400, where you're trying to take a little image clip and then saying that person is doing a robot dance or they're doing skateboard or whatever. So the question is, like, these networks that are trained to do this, they're just basically the three-dimensional versions of convolutional neural nets. Do they look like the brain or not?
Yeah.
And it turned out that they absolutely don't look anything like what the brain does for motion. So that was an interesting finding in itself, but we're like, well, we're still stuck because we have all this data.
Yeah.
Like, what actually explains this data? And so we trained this neural net on a very non-standard task, which is to predict how the camera is moving through an environment. So usually when humans take video footage, they try to use a tripod, right? Because it's very jarring when the image moves around a lot. So if I move around, I know that I'm moving. I control my muscles. I control my body, right? So I know that I'm about to move in different ways. But when it's somebody else that's doing it, it's just usually better, unless you're trying to do a very specific kind of film effect, to keep the camera stable. So you don't have like this kind of wide field motion. So have you ever done VR?
Yeah.
So a lot of people experience
like seasick.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They experience seasickness when, seasickness is a good example, right? So seasickness happens because you get like lots of optic flow, lots of wide field motion information, because you see the sea wobbling up and down.
Yeah.
Right. And it's not you that's controlling it. Plus, you get like the vestibular effect, right? From because we have like a little accelerometer inside of our inner ears, and so the combination of these things just makes your body like, nope, I don't like this. I don't like this at all. There's a mismatch between what I predict is going to happen and what's actually happening, and that's when you get seasick. So what we found is when we train a deep neural net to solve this task of figuring out like where this simulated person is moving in this environment, that learned really good motion representations which align to the brain. And in control analyses, we tried the same objective but in two different environments, and where one environment was motion enriched, so it was like this kind of thing. That where you're trying to predict the motion parameters from the sequence, and the other one which looked like the kinds of data sets like Kinetics 400, and one was just much better aligned with the brain than the others. So that means that the brain is really trying to solve this problem. It's the data that it receives that allows it to bootstrap itself into existence. So even for the brain, on evolutionary timescales, the models don't change and the data changes much faster.
Yeah.
Does that make does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. So I think that's you talk a little bit about the paper. Your head is there to move you around, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the paper that I was talking about. Yeah, it's named after a song from REM, which is a band from the 80s. So I apologize if people don't know that reference. It's a little bit dated. Don't go look it up on YouTube because it's a bit of an earworm.
And in the paper you mentioned you use ResNet 3D. So I worked on action recognition problems. So there are other options.
Really?
Yeah, like i3D, like slow, fast. Do you remember what made you choose the ResNet 3D?
Yeah, so it was precisely for this reason of teasing apart model versus data. So at the time that I really started delving deep into this project, the most popular architecture were 3D ResNets.
Okay.
And so I didn't want to make a point about if you pick this architecture which has all these like unusual elements, that's how you learn a brain-like representation. That wasn't the kind of paper that I wanted to write, although there's probably like some of that happening. I wanted to make a paper about how the data changes the brain's representation and how much the data is important in this whole task.
Yeah.
So I used architectures which were as close to possible as the kinds like i3D and slow fast, which were already in production and which were already popular at the time. So the ResNet 3D, it doesn't have any special significance other than that's what everybody was using at the time, or like variations thereof. And it just made the most sense, because people can say, well, your results are just because you have a different architecture than everybody, and you're baking in some inductive biases or something like that, because ultimately it's the same. In fact, some of the code for the 3D ResNet is, comes from like the residual pathway. It's almost like line by line what you would see in I think it's i3D or something.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, but as you mentioned, you could like really focus on the model, but I think the data is just so much more important.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And after you build a model, did you try to do some interpretation to look at the layer to see what the model is trying to see?
Oh yeah, that's my that is my the thing that I love doing. I work in vision, so
yeah.
When vision scientists look at things, they communicate it visually, because everybody's like, just think about like a room full of vision scientists, and then you're trying to tell them, I'm going to show you something, and you're going to look at it with your eyes and interpret it. Everybody's like, yes, I'm on board.
Yeah.
Don't show me the numbers, just show me the visualizations. Yeah. It's a very particular world in that way. But there's a long history of people trying to open up these black boxes. Right. And the brain is a black box in many ways, because it does stuff and we don't totally understand what happens in the middle.
Yeah.
And deep neural nets are kind of similar. So people have developed methods in neuroscience to solve these kinds of problems, the black box problem. And there are methods to visualize, for instance, maximal activations inside of intermediate layers. So yeah, so we did use that and variations of popular methods. And in fact, that was very helpful in diagnosing, well, what's the difference between an i3D that's trained on action recognition and my 3D ResNets? It turned out that the big difference is that one learns motion, in that, motion energy or like contrast moves from one location to another, versus frames through time is what I would describe action recognition. So if you look at the intermediate layers of action recognition networks like i3D, I can only describe it as people moonwalking. Like silhouettes moonwalking is kind of the standard thing that you find out of the intermediate layers, because there's a lot of categories that turned out to be dancing, walking, motion, basketball, whatever, that involves a lot of motion. So if you look at the intermediate layers, you try to maximize for that, you find a lot of people that are doing what looks like stuttering moonwalking.
Yeah. So does our brain also have this kind of temporal processing of motions when we recognize actions?
That's a very interesting question. So one point that I tried to make in the paper is that action recognition is, or people like to talk about biological motion. That's the jargon term that they like to use. I think that that's something, it's quite similar to shape, essentially. It's just shape with snapshots.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but you can sometimes look at people just the way that they walk. Like you'll look at them from behind and you'll immediately know who they are.
Yeah.
Just from the way that they walk, even if you can't see their faces.
Yeah.
So, you know, like a big muscly guy might walk like this. And whereas somebody that's a little bit more, you know, lean would like walk in kind of a different, in a different fashion.
Yeah.
So it turns out that these kinds of cues we use all the time. But in I think in action recognition in these networks, it's probably like the same kinds of representations that are used. It's the same kind that allow us to extract characteristics of people or of scenes, and we apply it for this other problem as well. So I think that these two problems are related, but they're more shape-like problems.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we don't necessarily use this information about people in order to self-navigate. Like, it's not like we see somebody like walking like this and we're like immediately, oh no, I'm going to get eaten by a shark, and then we move away. Right. Whereas the pure motion pathway is really about doing those kinds of snap decisions, like moving away, or like, oh, I just like hit a rock, so I'm seeing a lot of motion. I should like move my muscles accordingly so I don't fall flat on my face.
Yeah.
So it's these kinds of things that the motion pathway does. So I think that it's, if somebody at home wants to take a look at these problems, I think these are like really interesting and open problems. Like, how does the brain do action recognition?
Yeah.
And does it do it? And is it similar to what i3D does, for instance?
Right.
But how does it do motion recognition? It's not like i3D does it. That's what I know.
Yeah. I learned a little bit about the brain when I was reading about the slow fast model. It has a slow pathway and a fast pathway. And it seems like that's actually how our brain works, or how our visual like system works.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of ideas that are inspired by the brain. But importantly, in slow fast, they didn't prove that one of the pathways was more motion-like versus the other one is more shape-like. Yeah. And so when I tested slow fast, so this it should be the case that the slow pathway is more like shape, and the fast pathway is more like motion. Yeah, didn't find that.
Right, I think
when
it's
I
just
tried
that,
to align to the brain.
It seems like I think the architecture, at least the time when I was looking at it, just the number of frame they sample is different, but I don't think they specify which one is shape, which one is motion. Well,
the slow one should be shape. That's the hypothesis, but I didn't find it to be. I didn't find the so-called motion pathway to be very motion sensitive.
Yeah.
And you can do something really, really simple to determine whether a neural network is sensitive to motion or not, right? Which is, you show a grading, like this is a grading, right?
Yeah.
So it goes, white, black, white, black, white, black, right? And then you just move it across the screen. Yeah. And if the first layer neurons are selective for one direction and they don't like the other direction, then you've got motion sensitivity. And if you don't have motion sensitivity. So it turns out that i3D and slow fast, they don't have the selectivity in the first layers. Yeah. So they never really learn motion per se.
Right. Have you applied any learnings or philosophies from computer vision architectures into language models? I know there are like some people do convolution when they do text processing these days.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a really interesting question. I think that people are realizing more and more that the architectures don't matter so much. And in fact, you can really use anything for anything. So I was certainly very surprised by the Visual Transformers paper. So, transformers are state-of-the-art models. Famous models like GPT-3 are transformers. So they have these stacks of attention layers or self-attention layers that, slowly build up a representation and can do things like completion or translating different texts. And I think that people for a long time didn't think that those would be very competitive in vision. And then they did the visual transformers, and it turns out that they're very competitive, especially if you have lots and lots of data sets. So I think that there's a lot of cross-pollination. Like if you find a good architecture, probably the reason that it works well for a set of problems has less to do with it has a lot of inductive biases, especially as you get larger and larger data sets. But it has more to do with, is it easy to backpropagate through this to this architectures? Do the gradients blow up? Does it has like nice property throughout the training process and so on and so forth? And then does it have enough capacity? And the final thing is, can it be accelerated with the kinds of hardware that you have? Do you have like the right kinds of GPUs and TPUs and what kinds of special tensor operations they have implemented so that can be done efficiently. So those are probably the questions that determine whether a certain architecture is good for this for a problem or not. I think in the neurosciences, when we saw that the visual transformers were really killing it, so to speak, in image classification, we were kind of horrified because it really doesn't look like a brain. But then people found later that if you train them in just the right way, they are actually like quite a bit aligned to the brain. So, you never know. I wouldn't put a lot of faith into this type of model is better for this kind of thing. It's a bit of a moving target as well. And generally people like to use there's kind of these trends that come on board. Yeah. So I think if we took this interview like a year ago, it was like, I would be, ResNets all the way. If I say today, I'd be like, well, look at CLIP, look at different kinds of visual transformers. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I know you're working on some secret project. But what are some other research you done recently or you're working on that you can share with us?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm also interested in how the brain developed the way that it did, right? So we were talking about slow fast, and about how it has like these two parallel kinds of pathways, and so people can bake in these kinds of inductive biases into different kinds of networks, but the question is like, how did it happen inside the brain? Like, did the brain already have like baked in inductive biases and then like kept doing it this way, or like what's going on there? And so my colleague Shahab Bakhtiyari and I, mostly Shahab, I should say, work on this problem of looking at different kinds of training procedures that would let two different parallel streams develop. And so what he found was, I think is really, really interesting, is that if you train a network in a self-supervised fashion, so using a contrastive network or contrastively trained network, you can actually get two parallel streams that develop, and one of them is indeed more motion-like and the other one's more shape-like. But the two parallel streams, importantly, they weren't predetermined to be motion-like or shape-like, and they were completely symmetric before you actually trained. And so that's the magic there, is all you need to do in order to get these two parallel representations, which are specialized for two different kinds of things. It's just to place a little partition behind the two. So maybe you can learn some lessons about team management from that if you want. If you want people to specialize, just give them a little cubicle, and they might specialize for different things. I'm being facetious, of course. Yeah. But yeah, I think that was a really interesting lesson about evolution. But it's interesting because it recapitulates some weird or unusual things that people have found in training deep neural nets. So if you remember, this is going to date me, of course, the paper from Alex Krzyzewski and Jeff Hinton in 2012, the famous AlexNet paper. At the time, they only had GPUs that could have, I think, like 3 gigs of memory or something. So they were very, very limited. So what they did is they placed one set of filters for the first layer on one GPU and another set of filters on the second GPU, which was very unusual at the time. But they said, like, this is how we did it. Like, don't ask us. That's it. But one thing that was very interesting that they found is that they just trained this on an image classification problem. One set of filters specialized for color, and the other set of filters specialized for orientation. Okay. So to like edge detection, if you will. But the two sets of filters were totally symmetric. The network, it's not like it had something that was baked in that it was asymmetric. Yeah. It just self-organized into this asymmetric thing. And I think that was very interesting. And that might be a model for how the brain has evolved different functional specializations. Like basically, if you have modules which are unspecialized and you give them the right kind of data, and you give some sort of competition or something in between them, they'll specialize to do their own thing. And if you have a little bit of an inductive bias, like one is slightly more motion-like than the other, then the motion-like one will consistently become motion-like, right? So it just takes a little bit to be a little bit over the edge in order to get that consistent assignment. But I always thought that was such a cool finding from the early literature, and it took a long time for us to really understand what it even meant. I don't think that people like really understood the significance of that finding in 2012. Yeah.
So now, what do you think about the future of neuro-AI? What are some new opportunities?
Oh my! I think the field is wide open, and whenever I go to these occasions to do interviews, I always say to people, if you're interested about the brain, and you have technical skills, you like AI, this is the best time out of ever in history to jump into this field. Yeah. So anybody can jump in, and there are very nice training opportunities if you're, for instance, a graduate student, maybe not directly in neuroscience, but in an adjacent discipline, and you want to learn more about this. There are summer schools which people can go into, and they're very affordable. And I was involved in one of them, Neuromatch Academy. And so the first year we had 1,700 students in 61 countries and territories. The second year we had over 3,000 in 101 countries and territories, including in places where it's traditionally very hard to reach, like Iran, for instance. We had like a special license from the Department of State to be able to help Iranian students like get that education in neuroscience, and also a little bit in artificial intelligence. So if people are want to get like a quick overview of this field, through an intensive tree work program, like maybe they're a little bit like I was like 15 years ago, saying, wow, this brain stuff is really cool. Yeah. Where do I start? This is a great place to start. But there's never been a better time to jump in. And as far as like the long-term trends that I see, to me, that arrow from artificial intelligence to neuroscience, as opposed to the other one, it will keep growing. Yeah. And it will keep growing without bounds. So I wouldn't be surprised if you told me like 10 years from now, we'll have machines or models that I can just download off of Torch Vision or Hugging Face or something, and that will be aligned to brains. That will be excellent approximations of the brain, and that will be biologically realistic. That will be ecologically motivated, and that scale, and that have like all these nice properties. And are specifically tagged for different brain areas. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that happened. And it wouldn't just be for the shape part of the brain or for the different visual parts of the brain. This is going to be like a fully multimodal everything model. So you're talking about vision, language, even somatosensation, emotions, what have you.
Yeah.
So I think that's coming in the next 10 years. So if people start now, they'll be like right in on the game.
Yeah.
And BCI is coming along, right? So that's another incredible field to get into. There's just so many opportunities to help people right now. There's so many people suffer from neurological disorders and that really decrease their quality of life. And BCI has the promise to really help these people. And I'm sure that that many people are already excited. We saw the excitement, for instance, that people had about Neuralink early on, even though it was just on paper for a long time. And I'm sure that many students at home are wondering, well, how do I get a job at Neuralink, right? So people recognize this is a cool area to study, but there is definitely a path towards it. So if you're, a master's student, computer science, artificial intelligence, math, stats, electrical engineering, mechanical engineering, biological sciences, whatever, there is a path. So start with Neuromatch Academy, go to grad school, do a PhD in neuroscience. That's usually, it's not necessarily 100% necessary, but it helps. There's a whole world out there that's awaiting for them.
Yeah. And for data scientists who are curious to learn more about neuroscience, and if we don't want to read textbooks, do you have any books or papers or YouTube channels to recommend?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So there are podcasts that focus on this area of intersection. I would say that Neurally Inspired by Paul Middlebrooks, I want to say, is one example. There are written materials. There's a lot of great pop science books that are scientifically accurate and that give you a great overview of different parts of the field. So one example is Russ Poldrak's book, which is called The New Mind Readers, which is about using information from the brain and then translating it to, like reading information out of the brain. It's mostly focused on fMRI, but it's very good. He's a prof at Stanford, super in neuroscience, and he does a lot of interesting computer science stuff and statistics as well. Then there's, if you're interested in computer science in particular, in that or in modeling and that intersection of neuroscience, I would say Grace Lindsay's book, which is called Models of the Mind, is a great pop culture book. And the equations are all at the end. So if you want to skip the equations, just understand the intuition. It's all there.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for sharing that. And now when we think about your journey, what are something you wish you could learn earlier?
Something I wished I could learn earlier. Sometimes it's very, very hard to see the forest from the trees when you're starting out, right? So I was lucky in that I learned a lot of the fundamental elements like pretty early on. So that means the math, the physics, and the stuff that hasn't moved for the last 150 years, you can be almost guaranteed that it's going to stay for a long time.
Yeah.
Right. So so for instance, like Lagrangian mechanics, right? So I learned Lagrangian mechanics in physics. And it's a very strange framework to think about how you solve equations of motions and so forth, that involves like some infinite dimensional integral and differential calculus and all this stuff. But you know what? Like, this is the kind of math that the difficulty of math that you're going to need if you eventually like want to learn about optimization, for instance. So you might have heard about Lagrangian multipliers and so forth. So it turns out that having like this really good base is super helpful, regardless of what you're going to want to do. Programming, math, physics, you can't go wrong with that. And then the soft parts of it, like we can't really ignore. I mean, that's something that I didn't realize when I went into industry, that being both a nice person and a social person was actually very important in order to multiply the goodness of what I'm doing. If you have a good idea and you don't communicate it to anybody, like you're unable to say to somebody like, this is cool because of reason X, Y, Z. Or if you're a jerk, in meetings, that certainly happens. Yeah. Like the fact of the matter is you're not going to have a lot of impact. So really working on those skills, that's something that I would have recognized earlier. I would have liked to recognize earlier that it was important. As an academic, you're often rewarded for not doing that, right? For basically like going inside your basement and then just doing experiments for a week. Yeah. But when you're in an industrial setting, I mean, you really want to be able to talk to people. And I mean, the people that know about a lot of things end up having the most impact because they have a lot of business contacts. So that's something that I wish I had recognized earlier.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And can you share some mistakes you made?
Yeah, so I'll mention something that my manager at Google told me once. So I gave a presentation on vision and data science, right? Because that was kind of my thing, and I explained it with 80% stats, but I added a lot of vision into it because I think that it's also like a bad training as an academic. Like you want to show to people really fast that you're a really clever person that thinks deeply about things. And this is a mistake. Like don't try to sound like the smartest person that you can be because people won't understand what the heck you're talking about. And all they'll get out of it is like this person has their head in the clouds and they don't get it. Like they can't communicate with other people. So he told me, I want you from now on for the next week to talk about stuff, with your colleagues, but you cannot use vision jargon. Ooh. Don't use fovea, don't use the visual periphery, don't use primary visual cortex, don't use the retina, don't use anything.
You're like, I don't have any language anymore.
And I was like, that's like cutting off my arms, man. Why would you do this to me? But it was such a useful exercise because he said, well, you're limiting your impact by just not communicating at the level where people are ready to like really understand it. Yeah. And he was absolutely right because I had people in front of me who were like super, super smart people, PhDs in stats. From the best universities, but like they didn't understand anything about the brain because they had never studied it. And I didn't understand a lot about, their particular subfield of stats, like maybe like causal inference or like large scale Bayesian models or something. And so we had to create that common language. So if you can make that exercise, I think the best way to become good at explaining your research is to go on podcasts. Yeah. And then try to explain it to people from many different disciplines.
Yeah, especially when people listen to podcast, I know you guys probably doing laundries or cooking. So you need to explain in a way when people are not paying fully attention to it in a fun way. I think you did a great job.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I really appreciate talking to and like, I don't know, giving people my enthusiasm for the research and also for that intersection between industry and academia. I don't think that this is an either or situation. There's just a lot of cross-pollination. There's a lot of really interesting ideas which are bubbling up right now, and people will find a way to get industrial applications, but they need to keep that flow of information, that flow of knowledge open. And that just means being open-minded and open-hearted and, creating those connections.
Yeah. And previously, you shared some advice you got from your advisor during your PhD. In the industry, did you have any mentors, and what are some most important advice they gave you?
Yeah, so I mentioned one from Google. That was great. I think that was some great insight. I've got a lot of nice mentorship from other software engineers and data scientists, both at Google and at Facebook. I think that one thing that really resonated with me over the long term is how important, when you're inside of a big company, to try to align yourself to the company's interests, in terms of, if you want your research to or your work to really impact the company, like you need to do the legwork of explaining that.
Yeah.
So, well, of course, if you're in something like ads, I mean, it's obvious like why it's in the best interest of the company to make sure that the ads are working correctly and that, you know, they keep the cash flow in, and so on and so forth. When you're doing research, as I was at Facebook, or industrial research, it's also important to explain those different steps. And so one thing that I learned from my manager at Facebook is really to split all that uncertainty about a technical project and split it up into these different areas so that you can attack them one after the other, and you can really show milestones, right? So that when you come back to your supervisors in 3 to 6 months, they can really see the progress. And that can often mean, you know, changing the way that you do your Gantt chart so that you really align that progress to these milestones. Yeah, doing large scale projects, it's always hard, especially if it hasn't been done before. You know, if it's a Me Too project, a project that is very similar to another project that's been done before, you kind of know what to expect and how much time it's going to take. But how do you deal with massive uncertainty?
Yeah.
Right. So that's definitely something that I learned in my journey as well.
Yeah. So, for example, how do you deal with massive uncertainty, especially when there's the pressure of time?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, there's different kinds of models of uncertainty. One is you can have a sequential uncertainty, so kind of like a funnel, right? So let's talk about like marketing statistics, right?
Yeah.
So you have some funnel. So you're going to have people like click on your email. Maybe if they click on the email, they'll have some conversion to put stuff in their cart. And then once they put stuff in their cart, they're going to have some probability of actually like going through payment.
Yeah.
So every time that you do one of these things, you lose a certain percentage, right? So it's a multiplicative effect, right?
Yeah.
You start at one, and then you have to multiply all your losses together in order to get the final number. So uncertainty in projects is very similar. So if you have 3 independent processes and you're like, these 3 things have to happen in order for my project to be viable. So you can either the stats come out to be about the same, right? So it's the same kind of multiplicative effect. And so every time that you come in out of the gate, you're going to lose, maybe you have like 60% chance of your, like this one part of the project not working. Okay. But then like once you get into the 40%, then there's going to be like some secondary gate and third gate and so forth. So you can either, okay, so if you have a very limited amount of resources, what you should do is you should do the thing that minimizes the uncertainty the fastest, right? So if you have 3 things and one thing only has a 20% chance of working, that's the first thing that you should do. And you should go all in on that problem. You should put all of your resources towards it. And then after that, you go on to your second and your third milestone. On the other hand, if you have more resources, and really and I mean, by resources, I mean capital, and your problem is that you don't have a lot of time, which can often happen in industrial research, then what you should do is you should parallel path it. So you should do these three things, these three gates, in parallel. And so there's a process by which you look at all the elements of uncertainty. You partition the uncertainty. You try to chop them up in parts which have equal kind of uncertainty. Or maybe there's one part of the project that just has this huge uncertainty over it, and then you fully go down this path. Or if there's multiple parts which are kind of dependent on each other, you do these parts in parallel. So it turns out that if you're reasoning as you're reasoning as a data scientist, and if you're looking at conversions and marketing things, I think it's very similar to what you need to do in order to make a nice Gantt chart, for instance.
Yeah, I like that. It's gaining kind of philosophy from data science method and then apply that to real life. Now you are an independent research scientist, and do you have your own board of directors to give you feedback or bounce idea with?
So I'm lucky to have had a number of colleagues over the years that can give me feedback on papers. So I got 2 papers into NeurosCience this year. Thankfully, I wasn't like penning them in my basement by myself, in part because I don't have a basement. I live on the 3rd floor. But yeah, I mean, it's very important to have strong colleagues that can give you honest feedback. And it's very easy to get into a situation where nobody around you will really give you that crucial feedback that you need at that time. So you need to surround yourself with people who can be honest with you. And that can be negative and that can be positive, right? I mean, they can give you negative feedback and positive feedback. But in my view, negative feedback is positive. Right? Because it helps you grow and it helps you. So I once wrote an article, and it was, I was trying to do something that was a little bit out of my comfort zone. I wanted to take some neuroscience research and then explain to a general public how important this research was to think about, their own behaviors. And I sent a draft to a friend of mine, and he told me, I never want you to publish this. This is terrible. This is like to the lowest common denominator. I hate it. You did a terrible job. Please don't show it to anybody. And I put it back in my drafts, and then I never thought about it again. But it was great feedback because I read it years later, and I was like, oh my God. I was like really on a weird tangent there. But that happens. I mean, if you do a lot of exploration, some ideas are going to hit and some ideas are just going to be just bad. It's really important too to get, if you want to do research, for instance, to get like good research taste, so to speak. So there's Chris Ola's, there's a great guide from Chris Ola, who is a researcher who was previously at Google Brain, then OpenAI. He's now at Anthropic. And he has a guide on finding good research taste. And that takes a long time. And that is often going to require some back and forth with people who have a little bit more insight into, the field as a whole. You have to understand that when you start out as a grad student, you're going to ask some questions. They're going to be interesting questions, but you're going to have no wedges and no context for how to attack these questions. You're going to talk to your advisor, and they're going to have a lot more context. Same thing as when you go to industry, you're going to have some insights, and they might not be terrible insights, but you're not going to have a whole lot of business context. And you need that business context in order to make any sort of impact inside of the company. So it's always a back and forth there, to position yourself so that the thing that you want to happen actually happens, and the thing that you deeply care about gets forwarded. But you need that feedback. Working in a vacuum doesn't work for anybody.
It's just like how you train the model. You need to get a feedback and then do the gradient descent. Absolutely. So if you were to mentor some people, what's your best advice to them? I think you already gave a lot of advice. So what are other things you usually tell them? So I think I gave a few different pieces of advice.
I think that when you move to industry, I think that it's important to have some kind of game plan for how you want to navigate this. And it's important to recognize that some of your first roles are maybe not the roles that you will ultimately want to go to, but that you have to start somewhere. So I saw a lot, in my experience at Google, that people would start as software engineers in ads, for instance, and would end up at Google Brain or DeepMind because they really cared about artificial intelligence, but maybe didn't have the right background or insight. Right. So you can really have a lot of leverage and be very effective just by knowing systems inside of a company, for instance. So that's one way that you can crack this. However, it's very easy to maybe like lose sight of your personal interests in different things, and then just like kind of wander off and just do thing X, which may not be the thing that you originally anticipated. So, you have interests, and, a company has interests, and, a lot of the time they're going to be aligned, and sometimes they're going to be disaligned. But I would say, rather than trying to be the most generic person possible, just be the person that you are, but find out what kind of kindred spirits you can create through your interaction with your manager and with your company in order to create the impact that you need. The software engineering interview kind of forces you into a mindset where you're like, I am generic person X, right? Because the questions are going to be the same. It's like it's kind of standardized testing. But the reality is that once you're inside the company, you're training, you're not a generic person, right? And the impact that you can make is totally going to be dependent on that background that you have. So you get pushed into this funnel. So you don't have to be that generic person after that. Like, think about how that thing that you care about could matter to the company, and then make the best of it. Another example I had recently is I get a lot of students, grad students, postdocs, sometimes even professors that contact me, and they're like, I want to make the switch to data science. How do I do that? I had a prof recently who was at a tenured professor at a top 50 university in America. And he was telling me, I am a manager now, and I don't want to be a manager. And in academia, I can't not be a manager. Right. I want to get a data science job. How do I get that? And I told him, like, you have to stop applying for data science jobs, for generic data science jobs, because you're absolutely,
you're not going to stand out.
You're a bad candidate for this because you're overqualified on the one hand, right? But you're underqualified on the other hand. Go apply at startups or at different companies that have something to do with neuroscience and neurotechnology, even if it's not directly your field, and you're going to be 10 times more competitive. Like, a recruiter or the company is not going to, think about the mechanics of this, right? If you're fresh out of college, I think it makes sense for a recruiter, for a company to take a chance on you. But as you go higher and higher up your career, your career trajectory has to align more and more to the expectations of managers. So he would have had to essentially like come in as a manager, but he didn't want to be a manager. But as an IC, could he really hold his own against, people that have been in the trenches for a longer time? Exactly. But in any case, he switched his method and got into a startup maybe like a week later after I spoke to him. So I think it was good advice.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great advice. I think it's really important and similar to advice I give to people when they try to do transitions. Maybe you're a mechanical engineer and you don't feel super confident about your data science skills, and don't completely forget about your current industry. Use it as a leverage. Go into a company or a team that needs this type of background. Maybe they just want a mechanical engineer that knows a little bit of data science, and you come in as the person, and then you become this person who knows both data science and whatever background you have, and kind of use that as your advantage instead of a weakness, right? If you're just gonna become a generic data scientist, you're not gonna stand out.
Oh, that's so true. Another example, I met this person who was a bridge engineer. She was a civic, I think it's called civil engineering.
Right.
Right. I mean, and she wanted to switch careers to data science, doing things that are more directly related to things like architecture or maybe like geospatial data.
Yeah.
I mean, it just feels like you have much more of a wedge there than if you're going into another area.
Yeah. So what are something that you used to deeply believing about neuro-AI or, research or kind of in general in this realm, but you don't believe anymore?
I think that I used to think that we could learn, that we could create artificial intelligence systems that were kind of biomimetic, that we could not just learn from the brain metaphorically, but we can learn from the brain directly, use brain data, in other words, to train deep neural networks that would solve problems of, let's say, computer vision and so forth. And in fact, I pitched this idea to a research group inside of a startup that was doing research in neuro-AI. I think it was in 2015. And, I remember very well the CEO being like, "What? How is that going to work? What are you going to do there?" And I think I just had like an intuition, like, well, AI is so big, these things are going to come together. I don't totally get it, but we'll figure it out. And I was like, well, this is never going to work. And I realized that my idea was pretty bad. And the reason I say this is because it's so much cheaper to get data from sensors, from things like cameras, from LiDAR even, than it is to get data from the brain. So sometimes people are able to show that if you realign some pre-trained neural net to the brain, you can get it to be slightly better at task, but usually it's not against models which are state of the art. And by the time that the paper is published, it's not state of the art anymore. So I think if you're going to do research in neuro-AI and you want to say, I'm going to make AI better by looking at some neuroscience principles, it's not going to be these 1-2% things. You have to swing for the fences, right? You have to go deep. You have to be like, I think I need like a hippocampus in my model or something. Yeah. So that's one thing that I learned. I realized that when you create arguments for like this area of research, I think it's going to happen. You also have to look at technological trends, right? To see. So the argument that I made, like, you could use neurodata to train deep neural nets and then use them for computer vision. That maybe it's not economically feasible right now, but maybe it will be in the future. So what would be the data point that we would need for that? Well, you would need to show that you would need to compare Moore's law for computers against Moore's law for neuroscience data. And it turns out that if you look at, which are of course, like what is the doubling time for, let's say, the number of electrodes that you can measure in a brain versus the number of transistors that are in a chip, right? And it turns out that the doubling time for neuroscience is quite a bit longer than it is for silicon. Yeah. And that means that not only is that gap, that economic gap, large, but it's just getting larger and larger every year. Yeah. And so it's very hard to make a good argument that these technological trends are all going to go in the right direction. So if it's 1 million times more expensive now, in 10 years, it might be 10 million times more expensive now. So you can do a back of the envelope calculation like that and say, wow, that doesn't really work. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. And before we wrap up, what's something exciting in your either personal life or in your career?
I got a dog.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
exciting.
that is very exciting. So in my personal life, I'm lucky to be married to my wonderful wife, who's an ophthalmologist by training, and so she's an eye expert, and I'm a brain vision expert. So it kind of just works out. But one thing that where we're different is that she's loves animals very much, and I was always, it wasn't like really my thing when I was younger, and I realized as I grew older that that animals are just pretty wonderful beings.
Yeah.
And so it speaks to the power of flexibility. And I think in the same way that you can be flexible in your personality, you have to be a little bit flexible in your career, so that you can be a little bit like water instead of being like rock, right?
Yeah.
So go through the things, and I realized that it would make her so much happier in her life, and it would make me a little bit happier, but the second order effect would be so high. So we have a little Chihuahua. His name is Marvin. Marvin the Martian, or Marvin the muffin. I don't know if you've ever seen pictures of neural nets like trying to classify
dog and the muffin. Yeah, I shared that on LinkedIn before.
Exactly.
And also the bagel and a dog.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So he does look like a little muffin, a little blueberry muffin with 3 blueberries.
Yeah, there's actually a paper. I think someone was able to differentiate that. Yeah.
Well, that takes a lot of GPUs to be able to differentiate these two. They do look uncannily similar.
Yeah. And also I think you told me you and your wife met through swing dancing.
That's right.
Yeah. So what are some other things you like to do outside of work?
So we have a lot of hobbies, I gotta say. So one thing that we're working on right now, I love to go outside of my area of expertise, but apply technical things to maybe conventionally manual problems.
Yeah.
So we're working on an arcade cabinet right now. So we love video games. We love old school video games.
Yeah.
So we're building an arcade cabinet, using acrylic and a laser cutter to design the plans. So I'm really digging deeply into mechanical engineering for that purpose, which is far outside of my zone of comfort, but we're learning a lot through that.
Yeah.
And I should say that I've done research with my wife. I do have a paper with her,
awesome.
where we looked at how treatments for cataracts affect glaucoma, which is another disease of the eye that has nothing to do with it. And so that was a great learning experience. And if you want to stress test your relationship, I highly recommend trying to write a paper with your significant other, because you will work out all those kinks very rapidly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. So this is a great conversation. I learned a lot from you and had a lot of fun. And for our audience who want to read more about your research, follow your work, keep up with you, where can they find you online?
So I'm on Twitter. Please join my 10,000 or so other followers. I write about neuro-AI and about gaps in between industry and academia and everything in between. And I'm also on xcore.net, which is my blog. So if you want to put the links in the description, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button.
Subscribe. All right. Thank you so much for come to San Francisco and have this conversation with me. And hopefully we'll have this conversation again in a few years, and can't wait to read more about your new research, your secret project.
Absolutely.